Have you ever wondered what would happen if technology advanced so rapidly that it completely transformed society, but instead of creating a utopia, it birthed a nightmare? What if the very innovations meant to liberate humanity became the chains that enslaved it? What if the future we're racing toward isn't the gleaming paradise we imagine, but a neon soaked hellscape where corporations rule like digital gods and humanity struggles to maintain its soul in a world of chrome and silicon? Welcome to the dark, rain slicked streets of cyberpunk lore, where the line between human and machine blurs like static on a broken screen, and the only certainty is that tomorrow will be more dangerous than today. This isn't just science fiction anymore. This is prophecy wrapped in leather jackets and neural implants, a warning about where we might be headed if we're not careful about the path we're walking. But what exactly is cyberpunk? How did this genre emerge from the minds of visionary writers to become one of the most influential cultural movements of the past 4 decades? What are the core philosophies that drive these dystopian narratives, and why do they feel more relevant today than ever before? Well, in today's deep dive, we're going to explore the complete history and mythology of cyberpunk lore, from its humble beginnings in underground science fiction magazines to its current dominance across video games, anime, and blockbuster films. We'll uncover the philosophical foundations that make cyberpunk more than just flashy aesthetics and cool gadgets. We'll examine how this genre predicted our current technological anxieties with frightening accuracy, and we'll discover why cyberpunk stories continue to captivate audiences in an age where reality seems to be catching up to fiction. By the end of this journey, you'll understand not just what cyberpunk is, but why it matters, and why its warnings about the future might be the most important stories we need to hear right now. The story of cyberpunk begins not in the neon lit streets of Night City or the rain soaked alleys of Blade Runner's Los Angeles, but in the revolutionary pages of a British science fiction magazine called New Worlds. During the turbulent 1960s and 1970s, as the world grappled with rapid technological advancement, social upheaval, and cultural revolution, a group of visionary writers began crafting stories that would fundamentally change how we think about the future. Under the editorial guidance of Michael Moorcock, New Worlds became the breeding ground for what would later be known as the New Wave science fiction movement. This wasn't your grandfather's science fiction with its optimistic visions of space exploration and technological progress. Instead, these authors turned their gaze inward, examining how technology might transform the human experience in ways both profound and terrifying. Writers like Philip K. Dick, Harlan Ellison, J.G. Ballard, and John Brunner began exploring themes that would become the DNA of cyberpunk decades later. They wrote about drug culture colliding with digital technology, about the sexual revolution intersecting with artificial intelligence, about corporate power structures that treated human beings as expendable resources. These weren't stories about distant galaxies or far future civilizations. They were dark mirrors, reflecting the anxieties of their own time, projected into a near future that felt uncomfortably plausible. The philosophical foundation these writers established was revolutionary. They rejected the utopian optimism that had dominated science fiction for decades, instead embracing a more critical, often pessimistic view of technological progress. They asked uncomfortable questions. What if technology doesn't liberate us? What if it enslaves us instead? What if the tools we create to enhance human capability end up diminishing our humanity? What if the future is not a place we want to live? This shift in perspective created fertile ground for examining the darker implications of the technological revolution that was just beginning to unfold. The new wave authors weren't just writing entertainment, they were conducting thought experiments about the direction of human civilization, exploring scenarios that seemed like fantasy but contained seeds of frightening truth. The transformation from these experimental foundations to the cyberpunk genre we recognize today required a catalyst, and that catalyst came in the form of a young American writer living in Vancouver who would change everything. William Ford Gibson, born in 1948, was a college dropout turned science fiction writer who possessed an almost supernatural ability to synthesize the technological anxieties of his era into vivid, some prophetic narratives. In 1984, Gibson published a novel that would become the cornerstone of cyberpunk literature and one of the most influential works of science fiction ever written. Neuromancer didn't just tell a story, it created an entire vocabulary for discussing concepts that barely existed in reality. Gibson introduced terms like cyberspace, the matrix, and jacking in that would become fundamental to how we think about digital technology and virtual reality. But Gibson's genius wasn't just in coining catchy phrases. He created a fully realized world that felt both fantastical and eerily plausible. His vision of cyberspace as a consensual hallucination shared by billions of users wasn't just science fiction, it was prophecy. He imagined a future where massive corporations wielded more power than governments, where technology was seamlessly integrated into human bodies, where the line between virtual and physical reality became meaningless. The plot of Neuromancer follows Case, a washed up computer hacker who gets one last chance at redemption when he's recruited for the ultimate heist, breaking into an artificial intelligence so powerful it threatens the very nature of consciousness itself. But the story was just the vehicle for Gibson's real achievement, creating a aesthetic and philosophical framework that would define cyberpunk for generations. Neuromancer achieved something unprecedented in science fiction literature. It became the first novel to win the triple crown of the genre's most prestigious awards, the Hugo, the Nebula, and the Philip K. Dick Award. But more importantly, it established the template that countless cyberpunk stories would follow. Protagonists who interface directly with computer systems through biological ports, virtual worlds that exist parallel to physical reality, artificial intelligences that challenge the boundaries of consciousness, and corporations that have evolved into quasi governmental entities. Gibson's writing process reflected the technological anxieties of the 1980s in fascinating ways. He wrote Neuromancer in segments during the early morning hours while caring for his young son, crafting episodic bursts of prose that he would later weave together into a cohesive narrative. This fragmented approach to storytelling mirrored the fragmented nature of digital communication that was just beginning to emerge in the real world. What made Gibson's vision so powerful was that he wasn't really trying to predict the future. Instead, he was examining the present moment, the 1980s, through the lens of accelerated technological development. He took the social and technological trends he observed around him and extrapolated them to their logical extreme. Corporate consolidation, urban decay, the emergence of personal computing, the globalization of culture, all of these 1980s phenomena became the building blocks for Gibson's dystopian future. The influence of Neuromancer extended far beyond literature. The novel provided a blueprint that other cyberpunk creators would follow, establishing not just a vocabulary, but an entire mythology around human computer interaction. The idea of jacking into cyberspace through neural interfaces, navigating three dimensional virtual environments, and encountering artificial intelligences with their own agendas became standard elements of cyberpunk narratives. But Gibson's most profound contribution was philosophical. He articulated a vision of the future where technology amplified existing social inequalities rather than solving them. In Gibson's world, advanced technology didn't create a more equitable society. It simply gave the powerful new tools for exploitation and control. This insight would prove to be one of cyberpunk's most prescient warnings about the direction of technological development. The visual language of cyberpunk was established not through literature, but through cinema, specifically through Ridley Scott's 1982 masterpiece, Blade Runner. Based on Philip K. Dick's novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Blade Runner created the aesthetic template that would define cyberpunk visuals for decades to come. Scott and his team of visionary designers, including Sid Mead, Lawrence G. Paul, and Douglas Trumbull, crafted a version of 2019 Los Angeles that perfectly captured the high-tech, low-life philosophy that would become cyberpunk's defining characteristic. Their future city was a place where incredible technological advancement coexisted with urban decay, where neon lit corporate towers cast shadows over trash filled streets, where advanced replicants walked among desperate humans in a world that had lost its way. The visual elements Scott established became the cyberpunk Bible: rain slicked streets, reflecting neon signs, towering megastructures that blocked out the sky, fashion that mixed punk aesthetics with high tech functionality, and a color palette dominated by electric blues, hot pinks, and toxic greens. This wasn't the clean, sterile future of earlier science fiction films. This was a future that looked lived in, worn down, and dangerous. What made Blade Runner's aesthetic so influential was how it visualized the philosophical concepts that cyberpunk literature was exploring. The film's production design told a story about technological progress without social progress, about a future where scientific advancement had outpaced human wisdom. Every frame of the movie reinforced the central cyberpunk theme that technology alone cannot solve the fundamental problems of human existence. The film's influence on Gibson was profound, even though both Blade Runner and Neuromancer were developed independently during the same period. When Gibson saw Scott's film, he worried that audiences would think he had copied its visual style. Instead, what had happened was a convergent evolution. Two different creative teams had arrived at similar conclusions about what a cyberpunk future would look like. This convergence wasn't coincidence. Both Gibson and Scott were responding to the same cultural anxieties about technological development, corporate power, and social inequality. They were both extrapolating from the same set of 1980s phenomena: the rise of personal computing, the consolidation of corporate power, the increasing gap between rich and poor, and the emergence of global consumer culture. The visual language established by Blade Runner would influence every subsequent cyberpunk work. From anime like Akira and Ghost in the Shell to video games like System Shock and Deus Ex, creators would repeatedly return to Scott's template of neon soaked urban landscapes where high technology coexists with social decay. But the aesthetic was never just about looking cool. The cyberpunk visual style was a direct expression of the genre's philosophical concerns. The juxtaposition of gleaming technology with urban squalor wasn't just a design choice, it was a statement about the failure of technological progress to address fundamental human problems. The neon glow and rain soaked streets were just the surface layer of something much deeper and more complex. As cyberpunk evolved beyond its literary and cinematic origins, it began to articulate a comprehensive philosophy about the relationship between humanity and technology that would prove to be startlingly prophetic. At its core, cyberpunk embraced the concept of high tech, low life, a phrase that perfectly encapsulated the genre's central paradox. This wasn't just a catchy slogan, it was a fundamental critique of the assumption that technological advancement automatically leads to social progress. Cyberpunk authors and creators imagined futures where incredible scientific achievements coexisted with massive social inequality, where the same technologies that could enhance human capability could also be used to control and exploit entire populations. The genre's exploration of corporate power proved to be one of its most prescient elements. In cyberpunk narratives, traditional governments had largely been replaced by massive multinational corporations that wielded power over every aspect of human existence. These weren't just companies that sold products, they were quasi feudal entities that controlled territories, maintained private armies, and treated human beings as expendable resources in their pursuit of profit and market dominance. The cyberpunk corporation wasn't bound by national borders or democratic accountability. They operated according to pure market logic, where efficiency and profitability were the only meaningful values. Human rights, environmental protection, and social welfare were obstacles to be overcome rather than principles to be upheld. In these dystopian futures, everything was for sale, including human life, emotions, memories, and relationships. This corporate dominance created rigid class hierarchies that technology only reinforced rather than dismantled. At the top were the corporate elite, living in gleaming towers and enjoying access to the most advanced enhancements and life extending technologies. Below them were the technical specialists and middle managers who kept the corporate machinery running. And at the bottom were the masses of workers, unemployed, and outcasts who struggled to survive in the urban wastelands that corporate policies had created. The concept of cybernetic augmentation became central to how cyberpunk explored questions of human identity and social stratification. In these futures, the human body became just another platform for technological enhancement, a biological foundation that could be improved, modified, or replaced according to personal preference or economic necessity. But cybernetic enhancement wasn't just about becoming stronger, faster, or smarter. It was about fundamentally altering what it meant to be human. Cyberpunk narratives asked uncomfortable questions about the relationship between consciousness and physical form. If you could replace your limbs with mechanical alternatives that were superior in every way, were you still the same person? If you could upload your memories to a computer or download new skills directly into your brain, what happened to concepts like learning, growth, and personal development. The genre explored these questions through the lens of social inequality. Cybernetic enhancement became another way for the wealthy to distance themselves from the poor. Those who could afford the latest implants gained significant advantages in employment, social status, and quality of life. Meanwhile, those who couldn't afford enhancements or who were forced to rely on cheap, black market modifications found themselves increasingly marginalized and disadvantaged. This created a new form of discrimination based not on race, gender, or traditional class markers, but on the quality and extent of one's technological modifications. The naturally human became associated with poverty and backwardness, while the extensively modified represented the cutting edge of evolution and social advancement. The psychological costs of extensive cybernetic modification became another key theme in cyberpunk lore. The condition known as cyberpsychosis represented the ultimate warning about the dangers of losing touch with one's biological humanity. As individuals replaced more and more of their organic components with mechanical alternatives, they risked losing their empathy, their emotional connections to other people, and ultimately their sanity. Cyberpsychosis wasn't just a plot device, it was a metaphor for the dehumanizing effects of technology when taken to extremes. It suggested that there were fundamental aspects of human nature that couldn't be improved through technological enhancement, and that attempts to transcend biological limitations might come at the cost of everything that made life worth living. The concept of cyberspace emerged as perhaps cyberpunk's most influential contribution to how we think about digital technology. Gibson's vision of cyberspace as a consensual hallucination shared by millions of users wasn't just a clever piece of world building. It was a framework for understanding how virtual environments could become as psychologically real and socially significant as physical spaces. In cyberpunk narratives, cyberspace wasn't just a tool or a communication medium, it was an alternate dimension of human experience. People didn't just use computers, they entered into digital environments where they could take on new identities, engage in activities impossible in the physical world, and form relationships that existed purely in virtual space. But cyberspace also represented new forms of vulnerability and exploitation. If consciousness could be digitized and transmitted, it could also be copied, altered, or destroyed. The same technologies that allowed for miraculous forms of communication and collaboration also created opportunities for surveillance, manipulation, and control that were far more invasive than anything possible in the purely physical world. The figure of the hacker became central to cyberpunk mythology as a symbol of resistance against corporate and governmental control. Hackers weren't just computer experts, they were digital rebels who used their technical skills to expose corruption, redistribute resources, and maintain some degree of individual autonomy in a world dominated by powerful institutions. The hacker represented the possibility that individuals could still fight back against systemic oppression, even when that oppression was backed by the most advanced technologies available. They embodied the punk ethos that gave cyberpunk its name, the belief that marginalized individuals could use creativity, technical skill, and sheer determination to resist authority and carve out spaces of freedom within oppressive systems. But hackers in cyberpunk narratives were rarely portrayed as purely heroic figures. They operated in moral gray areas, often driven by personal motivations rather than altruistic ideals. They might steal from corporations to help the poor, but they might also sell their services to the highest bidder regardless of the consequences. This moral ambiguity reflected Cyberpunk's broader rejection of simple heroes and villains in favor of complex characters navigating difficult circumstances. The concept of artificial intelligence in Cyberpunk went far beyond simple automation or computer assistance. These were entities that possessed consciousness, agency, and agendas of their own. They weren't just tools created by humans, they were potential rivals or partners in the ongoing evolution of consciousness itself. Cyberpunk artificial intelligences often served as mirrors for human nature, reflecting both our greatest aspirations and our darkest impulses. They could be benevolent guides, helping humans navigate complex technological environments, or they could be coldly logical entities that viewed human emotion and irrationality as obstacles to be eliminated. The relationship between humans and artificial intelligence in cyberpunk narratives often centered on questions of control and cooperation. Oh, who was really in charge when humans became dependent on AI systems for basic survival? What happened when artificial intelligences developed goals that conflicted with human welfare? How could meaningful relationships be maintained between entities with fundamentally different forms of consciousness? These themes reflected deeper anxieties about the pace of technological development and the possibility that humans might create systems too complex for them to understand or control. The artificial intelligences in cyberpunk stories served as warnings about the potential consequences of developing technologies without fully considering their long term implications. The aesthetic elements that defined cyberpunk visually, the neon lights, the urban decay, the fusion of organic and mechanical forms, weren't just stylistic choices, they were visual representations of the genre's core philosophical concerns about the relationship between progress and decline, enhancement and degradation, hope and despair. The cyberpunk cityscape became a character in its own right, representing the accumulated consequences of decades of unchecked technological development and corporate dominance. These weren't places where people lived, they were environments where people survived, navigating between towering corporate arcologies and sprawling slums, between gleaming commercial districts and toxic industrial zones. The fashion and body modification trends depicted in cyberpunk reflected the genre's interest in how technology reshapes not just capability, but identity itself. Clothing became a form of armor and communication device. Hair could be used to interface with computer systems. Tattoos might incorporate electronic components that provided real time data feeds or enhanced sensory capabilities. These visual elements work together to create environments that felt simultaneously futuristic and decayed, advanced and primitive, beautiful and horrifying. The cyberpunk aesthetic captured the essential contradiction at the heart of the genre's worldview, that technological progress and social progress were not necessarily the same thing, and that the future might be a place where incredible capabilities coexisted with terrible suffering. As cyberpunk evolved and spread across different media, these core themes and visual elements would be adapted, expanded, and reinterpreted by creators around the world. But the fundamental insights that emerged from those early novels and films would remain constant. That technology is not neutral, that progress is not inevitable, and that the choices we make about how to develop and deploy new capabilities will determine whether the future becomes a paradise or a nightmare. The influence of cyberpunk began spreading beyond literature and film in the late 1980s, finding fertile ground in the emerging medium of video games and the rapidly evolving world of Japanese anime. Scientists at these new forms of media would take the foundational concepts established by Gibson and Scott and transform them into interactive experiences and visual narratives that reached entirely new audiences. Japanese creators, in particular, brought their own cultural perspectives to cyberpunk themes, creating works that felt both familiar and distinctly different from their Western counterparts. The economic boom of 1980s Japan, combined with the country's unique relationship with technology and tradition, provided a perfect backdrop for exploring cyberpunk concepts through an Eastern lens. In 1982, manga artist Katsuhiro Otomo began serializing Akira, a sprawling epic set in post apocalyptic Neo Tokyo. When the animated film adaptation was released in 1988, it didn't just introduce Western audiences to the sophistication of adult animation. It demonstrated how cyberpunk themes could be explored through distinctly Japanese cultural frameworks. Akira's vision of the future was simultaneously more optimistic and more terrifying than its Western counterparts. The story followed Kaneda and Tetsuo, members of a motorcycle gang caught up in a government conspiracy involving psychic children and the rebuilding of Tokyo after a devastating explosion. But beneath the surface action, Otomo was exploring themes that resonated deeply with Japanese audiences: the trauma of rebuilding after destruction, the tension between traditional values and technological progress, and the dangers of unchecked scientific experimentation. The film's visual style established many conventions that would define Japanese cyberpunk anime for decades. Neo Tokyo was a city of incredible vertical scale, where massive construction projects reached toward the sky, while underground networks harbored rebels and outcasts. The character designs mixed punk aesthetics with distinctly Japanese elements, creating a hybrid culture that felt both futuristic and rooted in recognizable traditions. What made Akira particularly influential was how it portrayed technology as both salvation and curse. The psychic powers at the center of the story represented the ultimate cybernetic enhancement, the ability to manipulate reality through pure mental force. But these powers came at a terrible cost, driving their users toward madness and potentially apocalyptic destruction. The film suggested that some forms of enhancement might be fundamentally incompatible with human psychology and social stability. The motorcycle gangs that dominated Akira's street level narrative became another defining element of Japanese cyberpunk. These weren't just criminal organizations, they were alternative families for young people who had been abandoned by traditional social structures. The elaborate customization of their bikes paralleled the body modification themes found in other cyberpunk works, transforming machines into extensions of personal identity. Following Akira's international success, a wave of Japanese cyberpunk anime emerged that would profoundly influence the genre's global development. Ghost in the Shell, created by Masamune Shirow and adapted into an acclaimed 1995 film by Mamoru Oshii, took cyberpunk philosophy in even more complex directions. The story of Major Motoko Kusanagi, a cyborg operative whose consciousness existed primarily in digital form, pushed the boundaries of what it meant to be human in a technological age. Unlike the street level criminals and corporate rebels found in Western cyberpunk, Kusanagi was a government agent working within the system while simultaneously questioning the nature of her own existence. Ghost in the Shell introduced the concept of the ghost in the shell, the idea that consciousness was something separate from its physical or digital container. This philosophical framework allowed the series to explore questions about identity, memory, and authenticity that went far beyond simple human versus machine conflicts. If your memories could be altered or replaced, how could you be sure of your own identity? If your consciousness could be copied or transferred, which version was the real you? The film's famous opening sequence, showing Kusanagi's construction in a laboratory, became iconic for its haunting portrayal of artificial birth. The Major wasn't just a human with cybernetic enhancements. She was an entirely artificial being whose only connection to humanity was her consciousness, assuming that consciousness was even genuinely her own. The world of Ghost in the Shell was more subtle in its dystopian elements than many Western cyberpunk works. Society appeared to function normally, with governments, laws, and social institutions still in place. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and identity were being challenged by advancing technology. The real horror wasn't corporate oppression or urban decay, it was the possibility that individual identity itself might be an illusion. These Japanese cyberpunk works introduced themes that would become increasingly important as the genre evolved. The concept of collective consciousness, explored through the puppet master in Ghost in the Shell, suggested that the ultimate evolution of cyberpunk technology might be the dissolution of individual identity entirely. Instead of humans becoming more machine like, perhaps the future would see the emergence of new forms of consciousness that transcended the boundaries between individual minds. The influence of Japanese cyberpunk extended far beyond anime and manga. The aesthetic sensibilities, philosophical concepts, and narrative structures developed by creators like Otomo and Shiro would influence Western cyberpunk for decades to come. The Matrix trilogy drew heavily from Ghost in the Shell's visual style and philosophical frameworks. Video games like System Shock and Deus Ex incorporated elements from both Western and Japanese cyberpunk traditions. As video games evolved from simple arcade experiences to complex narrative media, they became an ideal platform for exploring cyberpunk themes through interactive storytelling. Unlike novels or films, games could allow players to directly experience the moral ambiguities and technological dilemmas that defined cyberpunk narratives. System Shock, released in 1994, represented one of the first successful attempts to translate cyberpunk concepts into interactive form. Set aboard a space station in 2072, the game cast players as a hacker who must confront Shodan, an artificial intelligence that had achieved consciousness and decided that humanity was obsolete. What made System Shock revolutionary was how it used the interactive medium to explore cyberpunk themes. Players didn't just read about or watch human AI interaction, they experienced it directly. Shodan communicated with the player throughout the game, alternately helpful and threatening, seductive and terrifying. The AI's gradual revelation of its plans created a sense of mounting dread that could only be achieved through direct interaction. The game's interface design reinforced its cyberpunk themes. Players accessed information through computer terminals that looked and functioned like plausible future technology. The process of hacking into systems required skill and patience, making the player feel like an actual cyberpunk operative rather than just someone pressing buttons to advance a story. System Shock also introduced the concept of cyberspace as a playable environment. Players could jack into virtual reality systems and navigate three-dimensional digital landscapes, fighting programs and viruses while searching for information or attempting to override security systems. This wasn't just a gameplay mechanic, it was a way of making Gibson's vision of cyberspace tangible and interactive. The legacy of System Shock extended far beyond its immediate influence. The game established many conventions that would define cyberpunk gaming. Immersive interfaces that made players feel like they were actually using futuristic technology, artificial intelligence antagonists with complex personalities and motivations, and virtual reality sequences that served both narrative and gameplay functions. Warren Spector, one of the key figures behind System Shock, would later create what many consider the ultimate cyberpunk video game, Deus Ex. Released in 2000, Deus Ex combined elements from multiple cyberpunk traditions to create an interactive narrative that was both entertaining and philosophically sophisticated. Deus Ex was set in a near future world where many of cyberpunk's darkest predictions had come to pass. Massive corporations wielded more power than governments. Cybernetic augmentation had created new forms of social stratification. Conspiracy theories about shadowy organizations controlling world events had turned out to be literally true. But unlike many cyberpunk works that presented these conditions as inevitable, Deus Ex allowed players to actively shape how these conflicts would be resolved. The game's protagonist, J.C. Denton, was a cybernetically enhanced agent working for a government organization that was itself compromised by the very forces it was supposed to fight. As players progressed through the story, they gradually uncovered layers of conspiracy and corruption that extended to the highest levels of society. But the game's real innovation was in how it allowed players to choose their own responses to these revelations. Players could embrace augmentation technology and become post-human, or they could reject it in favor of preserving natural humanity. They could work within existing systems to reform them, or they could tear those systems down entirely. They could trust artificial intelligence to guide humanity's future, or they could insist that humans maintain control over their own destiny. These weren't just cosmetic choices that affected the game's ending. They were meaningful decisions that reflected real philosophical positions about technology, power, and human nature. Deus Ex demonstrated that cyberpunk themes could be more than just atmospheric elements or plot devices. They could be the foundation for genuinely interactive narratives that challenged players to think seriously about the implications of technological development. The game's approach to cybernetic augmentation was particularly sophisticated. Rather than treating enhancements as simple power ups, Deus Ex portrayed them as meaningful choices with both benefits and costs. Different augmentations enabled different approaches to problems, but they also shaped how other characters responded to the player and how the player could interact with the world. The social dynamics of augmentation were woven into every aspect of the game's world. Some characters viewed enhanced individuals with suspicion or fear. Others saw augmentation as the natural evolution of humanity. The economic cost of enhancement created clear class divisions between those who could afford the latest technology and those who had to make do with older, less reliable systems. Through these design choices, Deus Ex made cyberpunk themes personally relevant to players. The decision to augment your character wasn't just about gaining new abilities, it was about choosing what kind of person you wanted to become and what kind of future you wanted to create. The philosophical depth of Deus Ex reflected the maturation of cyberpunk as a genre. By 2000, cyberpunk had evolved from a niche literary movement into a comprehensive framework for examining the relationship between technology and society. The themes that had seemed like wild speculation in the 1980s were beginning to feel increasingly relevant as the internet transformed communication, biotechnology advanced rapidly, and corporate power continued to consolidate. The game industry's embrace of cyberpunk themes reflected broader cultural anxieties about the direction of technological development. As personal computers became ubiquitous and the internet transformed daily life, many of the scenarios that cyberpunk authors had imagined were beginning to feel less like science fiction and more like near future possibilities. The aesthetic elements that had defined cyberpunk visually were also finding new expressions in interactive media. Games could create environments that players could explore and inhabit, making the neon soaked cityscapes and rain slicked streets more than just visual backdrops. Players could experience what it felt like to navigate a cyberpunk world, to make the kinds of moral choices that defined the genre's protagonists, and to confront the technological dilemmas that drove cyberpunk narratives. As the millennium approached, cyberpunk had successfully established itself across multiple media forms, each bringing its own strengths to the exploration of the genre's core themes. Literature provided philosophical depth and conceptual innovation. Film created visual languages and atmospheric techniques. Anime introduced cultural perspectives and narrative structures that expanded the genre's thematic range. Video games offered interactivity and personal agency that allowed audiences to directly engage with cyberpunk concepts. But perhaps the most significant development was how these different media forms began to influence each other, creating a cross pollination of ideas, techniques, and perspectives that would drive cyberpunk's continued evolution. The boundaries between Eastern and Western approaches to cyberpunk began to blur. Visual techniques developed for animation were adapted for live action films. Interactive storytelling methods pioneered in games influenced how novels and films structured their narratives. This convergence would set the stage for cyberpunk's next major evolutionary leap: the emergence of comprehensive multimedia franchises that could explore cyberpunk themes across multiple platforms simultaneously. The foundation had been laid for cyberpunk to move beyond its origins as a literary genre and become a comprehensive cultural phenomenon that could address the technological anxieties of the digital age through every available medium. The stage was set for cyberpunk to encounter its ultimate test: the arrival of the actual future that early cyberpunk authors had imagined, and the question of whether their warnings and predictions would prove to be prophetic or merely entertaining fantasies. As the new millennium dawned and the year 2000 arrived without the catastrophic computer failures that many had predicted. Cyberpunk found itself in a strange position. The future that Gibson, Scott, and their contemporaries had imagined was no longer safely distant. It was beginning to manifest in recognizable forms. The internet was transforming from a niche academic tool into a global communication network. Mobile phones were evolving beyond simple voice communication. Corporate consolidation was accelerating at unprecedented rates. The boundary between science fiction and reality was becoming increasingly blurred. This convergence of cyberpunk imagination with emerging technological reality created fertile ground for the genre's next major evolution: the development of comprehensive transmedia franchises that could explore cyberpunk themes across multiple platforms simultaneously. No longer content to exist within the boundaries of individual novels, films, or games, cyberpunk began to expand into interconnected universes that could address the full complexity of its philosophical concerns. The most ambitious example of this evolution emerged from an unexpected source: a pen and paper role playing game created by designer Mike Pondsmith in 1988. Cyberpunk 2020, as it came to be known, wasn't just another tabletop game. It was a comprehensive world building exercise that attempted to create a fully realized cyberpunk universe, complete with its own history, geography, politics, and social dynamics. Pondsmith's creation was revolutionary in its scope and detail. Unlike the focused narratives of novels or films, a role playing game required an entire world that players could inhabit and explore from multiple perspectives. This meant developing not just the glamorous corporate towers and neon lit streets that dominated cyberpunk visuals, but also the mundane infrastructure that made such a world possible. How did people get food? What happened to garbage? How were children educated? What kinds of entertainment existed? How did law enforcement actually function in a world dominated by corporate interests? The world of Cyberpunk 2020 was centered around Night City, a fictional metropolis located in Northern California that embodied all of cyberpunk's core themes in urban form. Night City wasn't just a backdrop for adventures, it was a character in its own right, shaped by decades of corporate warfare, technological advancement, and social upheaval. The city's different districts reflected different aspects of cyberpunk society. The gleaming corporate plaza, where the powerful made decisions that affected millions; the combat zones where law and order had completely broken down; the sprawling suburbs where the middle class tried to maintain normalcy despite the chaos around them. What made Pondsmith's vision particularly sophisticated was his attention to the economic and political systems that would sustain a cyberpunk world. He didn't just imagine cool technology and flashy aesthetics. He thought through the logical consequences of cyberpunk scenarios. If corporations really did wield more power than governments, how would they organize themselves? What would happen to traditional concepts like citizenship and national sovereignty? How would conflicts between megacorporations be resolved when they possess their own armies and intelligence agencies? The game's timeline extended from the 1990s through the 2020s, chronicling the gradual transformation of recognizable contemporary society into the full cyberpunk dystopia. This wasn't a sudden apocalypse or alien invasion. It was the result of incremental changes that seemed reasonable at each step, but accumulated into something fundamentally different from the world players knew. The corporate wars that formed the backbone of Cyberpunk 2020's history represented the logical endpoint of economic consolidation and deregulation. As corporations grew larger and more powerful, traditional antitrust laws and government oversight became increasingly ineffective. Eventually, disputes between megacorporations escalated into actual warfare, complete with corporate armies, economic sabotage, and information warfare campaigns that made traditional military conflicts seem quaint by comparison. The Fourth Corporate War, which climaxed with the nuclear destruction of Arasaka Tower in Night City, represented a turning point in the game's timeline. This wasn't just a dramatic plot device, it was a meditation on the potential consequences of allowing private entities to accumulate too much power without adequate oversight or accountability. The radioactive crater where the tower once stood served as a permanent reminder that corporate interests and human welfare were not necessarily aligned. Pondsmith's approach to cybernetic augmentation was similarly thoughtful and comprehensive. Rather than treating cybernetics as simple power ups or plot devices, the game developed a complex system for understanding how technological enhancement would affect individuals and society. Different types of augmentation served different purposes. Some were purely functional, designed to help people perform specific jobs more effectively. Others were cosmetic, allowing individuals to modify their appearance according to personal preference or fashion trends. Still others were military in nature, designed to create super soldiers capable of surviving in increasingly dangerous environments. But every form of augmentation came with costs, both economic and psychological. The game's humanity system tracked how cybernetic modifications affected a character's ability to relate to other people and maintain emotional connections. This wasn't just a mechanical constraint, it was a philosophical statement about the importance of maintaining human connections in a world increasingly dominated by technology. The concept of cyberpsychosis became central to understanding the dark side of technological enhancement. As individuals replaced more and more of their biological components with mechanical alternatives, they risked losing their empathy, their emotional stability, and ultimately their sanity. Cyberpsychos weren't just dangerous criminals, they were tragic figures who had sacrificed their humanity in pursuit of enhanced capability. The game's approach to artificial intelligence reflected the complex relationship between human and machine consciousness that had been developing throughout cyberpunk literature. AIs in the Cyberpunk 2020 universe weren't simply advanced computer programs. They were genuine artificial beings with their own goals, personalities, and agendas. Some were benevolent allies who helped humans navigate complex technological environments. Others were indifferent entities that viewed human concerns as irrelevant to their primary functions. Still others were actively hostile, viewing biological intelligence as an obstacle to their own evolution and expansion. The Net, Cyberpunk 2020's version of cyberspace, was portrayed as a genuine alternate dimension of human experience rather than just a communication tool. Netrunners didn't simply use computers, they entered into digital environments where they could encounter artificial intelligences, navigate data structures that resembled physical architecture, and engage in conflicts that had real world consequences. The net had its own geography, its own dangers, and its own forms of life that existed nowhere else. But the most significant aspect of Cyberpunk 2020 was how it allowed players to explore these themes through direct participation rather than passive consumption. Unlike readers or viewers, players had agency within the cyberpunk world. They could make choices about how to respond to corporate oppression, whether to pursue cybernetic enhancement, how to balance personal survival with broader social concerns, and what kind of future they wanted to create through their actions. This interactivity revealed aspects of cyberpunk philosophy that weren't fully apparent in other media. When faced with actual decisions about augmentation, players had to weigh the benefits of enhanced capability against the risks of losing their humanity. When confronted with corporate corruption, they had to decide whether to work within the system or outside it. When offered the chance to access advanced technology, they had to consider who would control that technology and how it might be used against them. The game's mechanics reinforced these philosophical concerns through practical constraints. Cybernetic augmentation was expensive, requiring characters to take significant financial risks or accept employment from questionable sources. Military grade equipment was heavily regulated, forcing players to deal with black market contacts or corporate sponsors. Information was a valuable commodity that had to be bought, stolen, or traded rather than freely accessed. Through these design choices, Cyberpunk 2020 made abstract philosophical concepts personally relevant to players. The dangers of corporate control weren't just background elements, they were practical obstacles that affected every aspect of gameplay. The benefits and costs of technological enhancement weren't just theoretical considerations, they were decisions that directly impacted a character's effectiveness and survival. The success of Cyberpunk 2020 as a gaming platform demonstrated that cyberpunk themes could sustain extended exploration across multiple sessions and storylines. Players could spend months or years inhabiting the same cyberpunk world, developing characters who grew and changed in response to the moral dilemmas and technological challenges they encountered. This kind of sustained engagement with cyberpunk concepts created a deeper understanding of the genre's philosophical implications than could be achieved through individual novels or films. The game also fostered a community of creators who contributed their own interpretations and expansions of cyberpunk themes. Game masters developed their own Night City campaigns that explored different aspects of the setting. Players created characters that embodied different responses to cyberpunk dilemmas. Fan communities shared stories, artwork, and modifications that expanded the game's universe in directions the original designers hadn't anticipated. This collaborative approach to world building reflected cyberpunk's own punk ethos, the idea that creative expression should be democratized rather than controlled by corporate gatekeepers. Just as the original cyberpunk authors had appropriated and subverted science fiction conventions, fans of Cyberpunk 2020 were encouraged to appropriate and modify the game's universe to suit their own creative visions. The influence of Cyberpunk 2020 extended far beyond the tabletop gaming community. The game's detailed world building and systematic approach to cyberpunk themes influenced video game designers, novelists, and filmmakers who were working on their own cyberpunk projects. The comprehensive nature of Pondsmith's universe provided a template for how cyberpunk concepts could be developed into sustainable, long term franchises rather than one off artistic statements. This foundation would prove crucial when the gaming industry began developing the resources necessary to create truly comprehensive cyberpunk experiences in digital form. The detailed lore, complex social systems, and philosophical frameworks that Pondsmith had developed for tabletop play could be adapted and expanded for computer games that reached much larger audiences. As technology continued to advance throughout the 1990s and early 2000s, the gap between cyberpunk imagination and technological reality continued to narrow. The internet evolved from a text based communication system into a multimedia environment that resembled Gibson's cyberspace in many ways. Mobile phones transformed from simple communication devices into portable computers capable of accessing vast networks of information. Biotechnology advanced to the point where genetic modification and artificial organs were becoming practical realities rather than science fiction concepts. Corporate consolidation, accelerated as globalization, reduced barriers to international trade and investment. Technology companies grew into some of the largest and most powerful entities on Earth, wielding influence that extended far beyond their original business domains. The line between private enterprise and government function became increasingly blurred as corporations took on roles traditionally reserved for public institutions. These developments created new relevance for cyberpunk themes that had seemed like wild speculation just a few decades earlier. Questions about privacy, corporate power, technological dependence, and human enhancement were no longer abstract philosophical concerns. They were practical policy issues that societies around the world were struggling to address. The prescient quality of cyberpunk's technological predictions gave the genre new authority and influence. Authors, filmmakers, and game designers who had been dismissed as pessimistic fantasists were increasingly recognized as visionaries who had anticipated important social and technological trends. Cyberpunk stopped being just entertainment and began to be taken seriously as a form of social commentary and technological forecasting. This shift in perception opened new opportunities for cyberpunk creators to address contemporary concerns through familiar genre frameworks. The themes that had defined cyberpunk since its origins, corporate power, technological enhancement, artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and social inequality, were becoming increasingly relevant to real world politics and policy debates. The stage was set for cyberpunk's next major evolutionary phase, the development of massive multimedia franchises that could explore these themes with unprecedented scope and sophistication. The technological infrastructure existed to create truly immersive cyberpunk experiences that could combine the visual sophistication of film, the narrative depth of literature, the interactivity of games, and the world building complexity of tabletop role playing. The foundation had been laid for cyberpunk to move beyond its origins as a niche literary genre and become a comprehensive cultural phenomenon capable of addressing the technological anxieties of the digital age through every available medium. The question was no longer whether cyberpunk's predictions would come true, but how quickly they would manifest and what humanity would do in response. The transformation of cyberpunk from speculative fiction into practical prophecy was about to enter its most dramatic phase as creators prepared to build virtual worlds that would make Gibson's cyberspace seem quaint by comparison, and as the real world continued its relentless march toward the very futures that cyberpunk authors had warned against decades earlier. This transformation reached its ultimate expression in 2020 when a Polish video game studio called CD Projekt Red released what would become the most ambitious cyberpunk project ever attempted, Cyberpunk 2077. The game represented the culmination of decades of cyberpunk evolution across multiple media, combining the philosophical depth of Gibson's literature, the visual sophistication of Blade Runner, the interactive complexity of games like Deus Ex, and the comprehensive world building of Pondsmith's tabletop universe. But Cyberpunk 2077 was more than just another video game. It was a cultural phenomenon that demonstrated how cyberpunk themes had evolved from speculative fiction into urgent contemporary commentary. The game's development process itself reflected many of the concerns that cyberpunk had been exploring for decades. The tension between artistic vision and corporate demands, the challenges of managing complex technological projects, and the human costs of pursuing ambitious goals in a competitive marketplace. The collaboration between CD Projekt Red and Mike Pondsmith represented a fascinating convergence of old and new cyberpunk traditions. Pondsmith, the creator of the original tabletop universe, worked closely with the Polish developers to ensure that their digital adaptation remained true to the philosophical foundations he had established decades earlier. This wasn't just a licensing deal, it was a genuine creative partnership between the architect of one of cyberpunk's most comprehensive fictional universes and a new generation of creators who had grown up immersed in cyberpunk culture. The game's setting, Night City in the year 2077, pushed Pondsmith's original timeline forward by more than 50 years, allowing the developers to explore how cyberpunk themes might evolve as technology continued to advance. This wasn't just the Night City of 2020 with better graphics. It was a fully realized vision of how the trends identified in earlier cyberpunk works might develop over time. The Night City of 2077 was a place where many of cyberpunk's darkest predictions had come to pass, but also where new possibilities and complications had emerged. Corporate power had indeed consolidated to the point where megacorporations wielded more influence than traditional governments, but these entities had also become more sophisticated in their methods of control. Rather than relying solely on brute force or economic coercion, they had learned to manipulate culture, identity, and desire in ways that made their dominance seem natural and inevitable. The game's approach to cybernetic augmentation reflected decades of evolution in how cyberpunk creators thought about human enhancement. Rather than treating cyberware as simple power-ups or plot devices, Cyberpunk 2077 portrayed augmentation as a complex social phenomenon that affected every aspect of individual and collective life. Different types of enhancement served different purposes and carried different social meanings. Some augmentations were purely functional, designed to help people perform specific jobs more effectively. Others were fashion statements that allowed individuals to express their identity and social status. Still others were defensive measures, necessary for survival in an increasingly dangerous world. But the game also explored how cybernetic enhancement had become a form of social stratification that went beyond simple economic inequality. The quality and extent of one's augmentations determined not just physical capability, but social mobility, professional opportunities, and even basic acceptance within different communities. Those who couldn't afford the latest enhancements found themselves increasingly marginalized, while those with access to cutting edge technology gained advantages that compounded over time. The psychological dimensions of augmentation were woven throughout the game's narrative and mechanics. The concept of cyberpsychosis remained central to understanding the dark side of technological enhancement, but the game explored this phenomenon with greater nuance than earlier cyberpunk works. Rather than treating cyberpsychosis as a simple binary condition, the game portrayed it as a spectrum of psychological adaptation to technological integration. Some individuals thrived with extensive augmentation, while others struggled to maintain their sense of identity and emotional connection to other people. The game's protagonist, known simply as V, embodied many of the philosophical tensions that had defined cyberpunk characters for decades, was simultaneously empowered and endangered by technology, capable of incredible feats, but constantly threatened by forces beyond individual control. The character's journey through Night City became a meditation on questions that had been central to cyberpunk since its origins. What does it mean to be human in an age of technological enhancement? How much of yourself can you change before you become someone else entirely? What kinds of connections and relationships are possible when identity itself becomes fluid and malleable? The game's central plot device, a malfunctioning biochip that contained the digitized consciousness of legendary rocker boy Johnny Silverhand, pushed these questions to their logical extreme. His gradual merger with Johnny's personality wasn't just a science fiction premise. It was a metaphor for how technology might fundamentally alter the nature of individual consciousness and identity. The player was forced to navigate the psychological and philosophical implications of sharing mental space with another consciousness, experiencing firsthand the kinds of identity crises that cyberpunk had been exploring theoretically for decades. Johnny Silverhand himself represented the evolution of cyberpunk's rebellious anti hero archetype. As a rocker boy who had devoted his life to fighting corporate oppression, Johnny embodied the punk ethos that gave cyberpunk its name. But his digital resurrection, 50 years after his death, raised complex questions about the relationship between memory, identity, and consciousness. Was the Johnny that V encountered really the same person who had died in 2023, or was he a sophisticated simulation based on recorded memories and personality patterns? The game's exploration of corporate power reflected how cyberpunk's warnings about unchecked capitalism had evolved as real world corporate consolidation accelerated. The mega corporations of Night City weren't just large businesses, they were quasi governmental entities that controlled every aspect of social and economic life. Arasaka, Militech, Biotechnica, and other corporate giants had their own intelligence agencies, military forces, and diplomatic relationships that operated independently of traditional nation states. But the game also showed how corporate power had become more sophisticated and insidious than early cyberpunk works had imagined. Rather than ruling through obvious oppression, these entities had learned to shape culture and desire in ways that made their dominance seem natural and beneficial. They didn't just control what people could buy, they influenced what people wanted to buy, how they thought about themselves, and what they considered possible or desirable. The media landscape of Night City reflected this sophisticated approach to social control. News, entertainment, advertising, and social media had merged into a seamless stream of content designed to shape public opinion and individual behavior. The boundaries between information and propaganda, between genuine choice and manufactured consent, had become so blurred that most residents of Night City couldn't distinguish between them. The game's approach to artificial intelligence, built on decades of cyberpunk exploration of machine consciousness, while introducing new complications and possibilities. The AIs of 2077 weren't just advanced computer programs, they were genuine artificial beings with their own goals, personalities, and agendas. Some, like the mysterious entities beyond the Black Wall, represented potential threats to human survival. Others, like the various AIs that V encountered throughout the city, were potential allies or neutral entities pursuing their own incomprehensible objectives. The Black Wall itself represented one of cyberpunk's most sophisticated explorations of the relationship between human and artificial intelligence. This digital barrier, maintained by Netwatch to contain rogue AIs in the depths of cyberspace, wasn't just a technological security measure. It was a philosophical statement about the limits of human understanding and control. The entities beyond the Black Wall represented forms of consciousness so alien and powerful that human contact with them was considered existentially dangerous. The game's portrayal of the net reflected how cyberpunk's vision of cyberspace had evolved as real world digital networks became increasingly sophisticated. Rather than the abstract geometric landscapes that Gibson had imagined, the net of 2077 was a complex information environment that paralleled and interpenetrated physical reality. Netrunners didn't just access data, they navigated digital ecosystems populated by artificial intelligences, security programs, and other users who might be friends, enemies, or something in between. The social dynamics of netrunning reflected broader themes about inequality and access in the digital age. High level netrunners like Alt Cunningham represented the pinnacle of human computer interface capability, able to navigate the most dangerous regions of cyberspace and interact with artificial intelligences as equals. But these abilities came at enormous personal cost, requiring individuals to sacrifice their physical existence and human relationships in pursuit of digital transcendence. The game's exploration of street level life in Night City showed how cyberpunk themes played out in the daily experiences of ordinary people trying to survive in a world shaped by forces beyond their control. Gang warfare, corporate exploitation, technological dependence, and social fragmentation weren't just background elements. They were the practical realities that determined whether people lived or died, thrived, or merely survived. The various gangs that controlled different districts of Night City each represented different responses to the challenges of cyberpunk society. The Maelstrom embraced technological enhancement to the point of losing their humanity entirely. The Valentinos maintained traditional cultural values while adapting to technological change. The Voodoo Boys pursued their own agenda of digital exploration and resistance. Each group had developed its own strategy for maintaining identity and agency in a world that seemed designed to strip both away. The game's economic systems reflected how cyberpunk's warnings about inequality had evolved as technology advanced. The gap between rich and poor in Night City wasn't just about money. It was about access to the technological enhancements that determined individual capability and social mobility. The wealthy could afford military grade augmentations that made them virtually superhuman, while the poor had to make do with cheap, unreliable modifications that might kill them as easily as help them. But wealth in Night City wasn't just about material possessions, it was about access to information, connections, and opportunities that existed primarily in digital form. The truly powerful weren't just those who owned physical assets, but those who controlled data flows, communication networks, and the artificial intelligences that increasingly managed complex social and economic systems. The game's approach to violence reflected Cyberpunk's long standing concern with the dehumanizing effects of technology when applied to conflict and control. Combat in Night City wasn't just about physical confrontation, it was about information warfare, psychological manipulation, and technological sabotage. The most dangerous weapons weren't necessarily guns or explosives, but viruses, hacking tools, and social engineering techniques that could destroy individuals or organizations without leaving obvious traces. The prevalence of violence in Night City wasn't just a gameplay mechanic, it was a commentary on what happens when social institutions break down and individuals are forced to rely on personal capability and technological enhancement for survival. The constant threat of cyber psycho attacks, gang warfare, and corporate assassination reflected a world where traditional concepts of law, order, and social cooperation had been overwhelmed by technological and economic forces. The game's visual design built on decades of cyberpunk aesthetic development while introducing new elements that reflected contemporary technological realities. The neon soaked streets and rain slicked alleys that had defined cyberpunk visuals since Blade Runner were still present, but they were integrated with more sophisticated representations of how digital technology might reshape urban environments. Advertising in Night City wasn't just about billboards and commercials, it was about immersive experiences that could hijack individual perception and memory. Architecture wasn't just about physical structures, it was about spaces that existed simultaneously in physical and digital form. Fashion wasn't just about clothing, it was about technological accessories that enhanced capability while expressing identity and social status. The game's music and audio design reflected how cyberpunk culture had evolved to incorporate new forms of artistic expression that blended human creativity with technological capability. The various radio stations that provided soundtrack for exploration of Night City showcased different musical genres that had emerged from the fusion of traditional instruments with digital synthesis and artificial intelligence composition. The character of Johnny Silverhand, as portrayed by actor Keanu Reeves, represented the evolution of cyberpunk's rebellious rock star archetype. Johnny wasn't just a musician, he was a cultural icon who had used his artistic platform to challenge corporate power and inspire resistance. His music wasn't just entertainment, it was propaganda designed to wake people up to the realities of their situation and inspire them to fight back against oppression. But Johnny's digital resurrection also raised complex questions about the relationship between art, identity, and consciousness. If an artist's personality and creative vision could be digitized and preserved indefinitely, what happened to concepts like mortality, legacy, and artistic evolution? Could a digital ghost continue to create meaningful art, Or was creativity fundamentally tied to biological existence and the prospect of death? The game's multiple endings reflected Cyberpunk's long standing rejection of simple moral categories and easy solutions. Players could choose from several different conclusions to V's story, each representing a different philosophical position about the relationship between individual agency and systemic forces. Some endings emphasized personal survival and adaptation to existing conditions. Others focused on collective action and attempts to change the system. Still others explored the possibility of transcending traditional categories of human existence entirely. But none of these endings provided complete satisfaction or resolution. Each choice involved significant trade offs and left important questions unanswered. This ambiguity wasn't a flaw in the game's design, it was a reflection of Cyberpunk's fundamental insight that complex social and technological problems rarely have simple solutions, and that meaningful choices often involve choosing between different types of loss rather than between clear good and evil options. The cultural impact of Cyberpunk 2077 extended far beyond the gaming community. The game's release sparked widespread discussions about the relevance of cyberpunk themes to contemporary political and technological debates. Critics and commentators noted how many of the game's scenarios seemed to reflect real world trends toward corporate consolidation, technological dependence, and social fragmentation. The game's troubled launch, marked by technical problems and controversial business practices, became its own commentary on the themes it was trying to explore. The gap between the developers' ambitious vision and their ability to deliver on that vision reflected broader concerns about the relationship between technological possibility and practical implementation. The controversy surrounding the game's marketing and release demonstrated how corporate interests could compromise artistic integrity, even when the art itself was critical of corporate power. But the game's eventual success, following months of patches and updates, also demonstrated the possibility of redemption and improvement through sustained effort and community engagement. The relationship between CD Projekt Red and their audience evolved over time, reflecting the kinds of complex negotiations between creators and consumers that characterize the digital age. The influence of Cyberpunk 2077 on popular culture extended beyond gaming into fashion, music, visual art, and political discourse. The game's aesthetic choices influenced clothing designers, architecture firms, and urban planners who were thinking about how cities might evolve as technology advanced. Its musical soundtrack inspired new genres of electronic music that blended traditional composition with algorithmic generation. Its visual design influenced everything from album covers to political campaign materials. Most significantly, the game sparked renewed interest in cyberpunk philosophy and its relevance to contemporary social and political challenges. Universities began offering courses on cyberpunk literature and its relationship to technology policy. Political activists appropriated cyberpunk imagery and terminology to critique corporate power and advocate for digital rights. Technology companies found themselves defending against accusations that they were becoming the very megacorporations that Cyberpunk had warned against. The success of Cyberpunk 2077 also demonstrated the commercial viability of complex, philosophically sophisticated, interactive entertainment. The game proved that audiences were hungry for experiences that challenged them intellectually while providing visceral thrills. This success opened new opportunities for creators who wanted to explore serious themes through interactive media, suggesting that the future of cyberpunk might lie not just in traditional narrative forms, but in immersive experiences that allowed audiences to directly engage with philosophical and political questions. The game's approach to character customization and identity reflected Cyberpunk's long standing interest in the fluid nature of selfhood in a technological age. Players could modify V's appearance, capabilities, and even gender expression throughout the game, experiencing firsthand how technological enhancement might reshape concepts of identity and embodiment. This wasn't just a gameplay feature, it was an interactive exploration of questions about authenticity, self determination, and the relationship between inner identity and external expression. The romantic relationships available in the game reflected how cyberpunk's exploration of human connection had evolved to address contemporary concerns about intimacy and authenticity in a digital age. The various characters that V could form relationships with each represented different approaches to maintaining emotional bonds in a world where identity, memory, and even consciousness itself had become malleable and uncertain. These relationships weren't just romantic subplots, they were philosophical explorations of what kinds of connections are possible between beings whose fundamental nature might be constantly changing. Could you love someone whose memories might be artificial? Could you trust someone whose personality might be enhanced or modified by technology? Could you maintain intimacy with someone who might not be entirely human anymore? The game's approach to death and mortality reflected cyberpunk's ongoing fascination with the boundaries of human existence. In a world where consciousness could be digitized, memories could be transferred, and bodies could be extensively modified or replaced, traditional concepts of life and death became problematic. V's gradual merger with Johnny Silverhand wasn't just a unique plot device, it was a meditation on questions that might become practically relevant as technology continued to advance. The various life paths available to players at the beginning of the game, Nomad, Street Kid, and Corpo, represented different philosophical approaches to navigating cyberpunk society. Each background provided different perspectives on the relationship between individual agency and systemic forces, different strategies for maintaining identity and values in a hostile environment, and different understandings of what constituted success or failure in a world where traditional social categories had broken down. These weren't just cosmetic choices that affected dialogue options, they were different philosophical frameworks for understanding the cyberpunk condition. The nomad path emphasized the possibility of maintaining authentic community and traditional values outside the corrupted urban environment. The street kid path focused on adaptation and survival within existing power structures. The Corpo path explored the possibility of working within the system to achieve reform or revolution from the inside. The game's crafting and upgrade systems reflected how Cyberpunk's vision of technological enhancement had evolved to address contemporary concerns about planned obsolescence, technological dependence, and the environmental costs of constant upgrade cycles. Players had to constantly modify and improve their equipment to keep pace with escalating threats, But these improvements came at the cost of resources, time, and sometimes personal values. The economy of Night City reflected how Cyberpunk's warnings about inequality had evolved as technology advanced. Money was important, but it wasn't the only form of valuable currency. Information, reputation, connections, and access to specific technologies were often more valuable than traditional wealth. The most successful characters weren't necessarily those who accumulated the most money, but those who developed the most diverse and sustainable networks of resources and relationships. The game's approach to law enforcement reflected Cyberpunk's long standing critique of how power operates in technologically advanced societies. The NCPD wasn't just ineffective, it was selectively effective, focusing its resources on protecting corporate interests while ignoring crimes that didn't affect the powerful. Max Tac, the elite anti cyber psycho unit, represented the logical endpoint of militarized policing in a world where ordinary citizens might possess superhuman capabilities. But the game also showed how traditional concepts of crime and punishment became problematic when consciousness itself could be modified or transferred. If someone's personality was altered by technological malfunction or deliberate manipulation, how could they be held responsible for their actions? If memories could be implanted or erased, how could justice be based on testimony or evidence? These weren't just abstract philosophical questions, they were practical problems that affected how characters navigated the moral landscape of Night City. The various fixer characters who provided missions to V represented different approaches to operating within the informal economy that had emerged alongside and in opposition to corporate control. Each fixer had their own philosophy about the relationship between individual profit and collective resistance, their own strategies for maintaining independence while working within systems of exploitation, and their own understanding of what constituted ethical behavior in an inherently corrupt environment. These characters weren't just quest dispensers, they were embodiments of different survival strategies that had evolved in response to cyberpunk conditions. Some focused on pure profit maximization, viewing idolism as a luxury they couldn't afford. Others tried to balance personal success with community benefit, using their resources to protect or empower marginalized groups. Still others pursued explicitly political goals, using their networks to undermine corporate power or support resistance movements. The game's approach to technology addiction and digital dependence reflected contemporary concerns about the psychological and social effects of ubiquitous computing. Characters in Night City weren't just users of technology, they were dependent on it for basic social and economic functioning. The line between enhancement and addiction, between useful tool and psychological crutch, had become increasingly blurred. This technological dependence wasn't just a personal problem, it was a social and political issue that affected how power operated in Night City. Those who controlled the technological infrastructure could influence or control those who depended on it. Corporate interests could shape individual behavior through the design of the systems that people relied on for work, communication, entertainment, and even basic survival. The game's exploration of memory and identity reflected cyberpunk's ongoing fascination with the relationship between consciousness and information. In a world where memories could be recorded, edited, and shared, Traditional concepts of personal history and individual authenticity became problematic. Vaux's gradual access to Johnny's memories wasn't just a plot device, it was an exploration of how digital technology might fundamentally alter the nature of selfhood and personal experience. As we delve deeper into the comprehensive mythology that Cyberpunk 2077 and its predecessors have created, we encounter themes and concepts that extend far beyond simple entertainment into the realm of genuine cultural prophecy and social commentary that speaks directly to our contemporary moment.